Our words for reflection are taken from the writings of the late Michael Novak in a book titled Ascent of the Mountain, Flight of the Dove. I'll be returning to these words in my sermon in just a little bit later. Michael Novak. Religion, some think, is believing in doctrines, belonging to an organization, saving one's soul through an attitude like trusting God or works. But there are countless ways of living out the same doctrine, many different ways of belonging, an endless number of ways of misperceiving one's own soul. That is why it seems better to imagine religion as the telling of a story with one's life. Each person's life does tell a story. Often the stories meander. Few persons tell one single story. It is not true that faith, creed, or convictions come first and then action. It is rather true that we are already acting long before we are clear about our ultimate convictions. The two fundamental religious questions are, who am I and who are we? We human beings under these stars. It is always a joy to come back to the congregation that was such a major part, played such a major role in my ministerial career. In the course of my ministry here and in other places, I came to see that sermon preparation was a bit like baking a cake or creating a salad. You gather up some ingredients, you put them together, and you see what you get, knowing that sometimes it will turn out better than others. In that spirit, the ingredients for today's sermon are the first source of our living tradition, as stated in our Unitarian Universalist principles and purposes, the passage from the late Michael Novak that we heard just a few minutes ago. We add in a dash of Anne Lamott and mix in a couple of personal experiences, and we'll see what this gives us on this matter of what is a religious experience. So, first ingredient, that first source of our Unitarian Universalist living tradition, direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder, affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of the spirit. I played a small role in getting these words in our purposes and principles in place. I was a delegate, dating myself here, I know, I was a delegate to the 1984 General Assembly in Columbus, Ohio, when, after hours of discussion and debate, the language was ratified. And I raised up my card to vote yes when, at last, the final vote was called. And I was especially appreciative that when it came to arranging the order of the sources, the one naming direct experience was put at the top of the list. For if you're familiar with this, you know that it is after citing direct experience of transcending mystery and wonder that then other sources of our living tradition are named. Words and deeds of prophetic women and men, Jewish and Christian teachings, humanist teachings, earth-centered traditions, and the like. And this very arrangement is a telling indicator, really, about how we Unitarian Universalists do religion. We begin with experience, and then we look for language, for some sources of wisdom to help us give voice to that experience, to help us better understand it, and to have it guide our lives. Now, this is something of a 180 from how more traditional religions work. They begin with a language, or a creed, or a set of beliefs into which the adherents of that faith are supposed to fit their experience. We Unitarian Universalists begin with experience and then seek out a language and certain affirmations that will help us find better and deeper meaning in that experience. Not all of us come to the same language. Not all of us come to the same beliefs. And this is truly one of the beauties of our faith tradition. One of the many purposes our Unitarian Universalist congregations serve is to provide a place, to provide a setting where we bring our direct experiences of transcending mystery and wonder into a community where we can share them and find meaning in them. Permit me a personal note at this point. I left the ministry of a liberal Protestant denomination to become a UU minister over 40 years ago. By then, I'd already made my way from the near fundamentalism of my upbringing to liberal Christianity. And then I came to see that even liberal Christianity, for which I have the greatest respect and admiration, still begins with a set body of articulated beliefs and language into which I was supposed to integrate my religious and spiritual journey. Now, a lot of leeway was given as to how the language of liberal Christianity could be interpreted, but it was still a language I was expected to use in conducting my ministry. And at some point, I guess I was in my early 30s, I came to see that if I were to remain in the ministry, I'd need a place where that formula could be turned around. Experience first, then whatever language, beliefs, or affirmations I and the others I was in ministry with might come to. And fortunately for me, there was this place called Unitarian Universalism, which meant I didn't have to go looking for another job. And in fairness to my liberal religious friends, to say nothing of family members, those who do identify with a more traditional faith, I will add this. They too, by and large, begin with experience. They just happen to find that the language and the precepts of a particular faith tradition help best respond to their experience. And as I noted, I completely respect that. Well, moving on now. Let's take a look at some of those words of the late Michael Novak that we heard a little while ago. It is not true that faith, creed, and convictions come first and then action or experience. It is rather true that we are already acting or experiencing long before we are clear about our ultimate convictions. Well, this passage simply restates what I have just been saying. And Mr. Novak was a lifelong Catholic, but he still held that experience or action come first when it comes to faith formation. And for him, it was his Catholicism that helped him give voice and understanding to his experience. I'll add that while Michael Novak originally came from the Catholic left, and in the mid-60s, he wrote a book titled A Theology for Radical Politics, he came to take a rather hard-right neoconservative turn. So while Mr. Novak and I parted company theologically, or parted company, politically, I still find some good guidance in some of his writings, some of his earlier writings, and may he rest in peace. The title, as I noted, of Mr. Novak's book that we are using today is Ascent of the Mountain, Flight of the Dove. It came out nearly 50 years ago, and I find it as timely as ever. A very worn copy of the book remains on my shelves. The title is Mr. Novak's metaphor for the religious or spiritual journey. Much of that journey is like climbing a mountain, moving from one standpoint to another, thinking, probing, exploring, and then, often when we least expect it, coming across the landscape is the flight of the dove, the sudden moment of inspiration, an experience that can first leave us wordless as we simply take it in. And then we take that experience back to our climbing the mountain for what it can tell us about who we are and where we're going. Last summer, I offered you a sermon based on a book I'd written titled God is Not God's Name, A Journey Beyond Words. I used a line from the writings of Anne Lamott to introduce it. When we are stunned beyond words, we are finally starting to get somewhere. Try that again. When we are stunned beyond words, we are finally starting to get somewhere. Just over a week ago, I had the joy of taking part in an online writing seminar that Ms. Lamott conducted. It was grateful for me. It was a wonderful experience to do that. Her writings have played an important role in my own ascent to the mountain, and she has given me a few flights of the dove as well. What then is a religious experience? It is an occurrence that first calls us out of ourselves and then calls us back in to some of the deepest places, some of the deepest areas of ourselves. As such, it has two parts. First, being stunned beyond words, and then doing the reflection that helps one find the words that give lasting meaning to that experience. And then we integrate that experience and that reflection into the larger story we are each telling with our lives. Novak again. Religion, some think, is believing in doctrines, belonging to an organization, saving one's soul through an attitude like trusting God. But there are countless ways of living out the same doctrine, many different ways of belonging. This is why it seems better to imagine religion as the telling of a story with one's life. Novak then adds, the two fundamental religious questions are, who am I and who are we human beings under these stars? Well, it's story time. Story time. Several years ago, I was on a program at this funky little place down in California's Big Sur country called the Henry Miller Memorial Library. Now, the term is a misnomer. It's not really a library. It's a combination of a bookstore as well as a site or a place for artistic and musical and literary events, of one of which I was on a program for. Mostly, it's just a fun place to hang out in the middle of this redwood grove. And it's near the site of the home where the novelist Henry Miller lived during the Big Sur phase of his life. I'd spent the night before, camped out on the Miller Library grounds with some friends in an RV. I woke up at dawn and decided to take a walk going north along California's Highway 1. I hadn't gone more than 100 yards before I had to stop and sit down on a log because I was stunned beyond words. The sky was perfectly clear. A seemingly endless ocean was on my left. On my right was a large cluster of redwood trees with a thin layer of fog resting on the top branches. And just below the fog, the rising sun was shining through the branches. Yeah, I was stunned beyond words. And then I got some words. Those of you who attended the service last Sunday heard them sung. You heard the tune a little later. I realized I was walking a ribbon of highway by a redwood forest, and the sun came shining, and the fog was lifting. Woody Guthrie gave me the words to my wordless experience. And sitting there, I realized that I was in a land not just made for you and me, but made for all the people, especially those who were the first people here, for all the sentient beings who inhabit this land. It is a land for all of us, as widely as one can define the word us. And I'm sitting here in this land as one small piece of a much, much larger and tremendously diverse we. As you can tell, that moment has stayed with me. I have returned to that ribbon of highway moment many times in the years that have followed. I'm finding it's a place I especially need to go to these days as I try, sometimes with great difficulty, to hold on to some hope and to maintain my sanity in the midst of some of the insanity and some of the madness, deadly and hateful as much of it is, and with much of it coming from the highest elective office in our land. My moment on that ribbon of highway and my subsequent reflecting on it was and is a religious experience in what I take to be the truest sense of the word. And as I just said, it is one that still helps to sustain me in these often deeply troubling times in which we live. Well, okay, that partly answers the religious experience question, but not completely. Remember, Novak said there are two fundamental religious questions. Who am I and who are we under these stars? Who are we under these stars? I would offer that this second question, which is also ultimately a religious question, is one that we as a nation and society have been grappling with over the past several months, if not over the past several years. Who are we? The question comes in the midst of a pandemic that is touching and affecting our lives on so many levels: physical, emotional, psychological, and spiritual. And in the midst of this COVID-19 pandemic, we are also in the midst of a racial awakening and a long overdue racial reckoning with our history that is indeed asking us, who are we? Who are we as a nation at this moment in time and under these stars? And now my second story. This one took place only just a few blocks away from our church. As did a number of you, I attended the vigil in Greeley Park back on June the 6th, following the death in Minneapolis of George Floyd at the hands and in the custody of the Minneapolis police. His name was one of those several African Americans that were invoked at this vigil and rally who had also met with similar and horrible fates. The area, some of you know it, was in front of the Greeley Park bandshell, which was large enough for those of us who attended to be safely distanced and masked. The gathering was hosted or was organized by the Nashua chapter of the NAACP and a newly formed Black Lives Matter of Nashua group. And I was really delighted and proud that Reverend Allison was one of two local ministers who offered an invitation for that gathering. The moderator of the event, who introduced the speakers and kind of kept it moving along, was an amazing young man named Jordan. I'm guessing he was probably in his early 20s. I'd known his grandmother many years earlier during my Nashua ministry as one of the co-founders I worked with in forming Nashua's NAACP chapter. And at one point in the evening, this young man, Jordan, took time out from running the program there to offer some of his own thoughts on the meaning of our gathering. And he looked out over that crowd. It was close to 1,000 people. And he said, "This is our Selma." His 4 words, "This is our Selma," left me momentarily stunned beyond words. It was a flight of the dove. For all the good things that I know were said after that, I didn't hear much of it. I needed to reflect right then and there on what was happening to me when I heard the words, "This is our Selma." I sat there, now halfway through the 8th decade of my life, realizing that I had been approximately this young man's age when Martin Luther King led the Selma to Montgomery March. I wasn't there, but I remembered it well. While I did not shed any actual tears in that moment, I had to wonder, do I weep out of grief or out of joy and hope at what I just heard? It's some of both, of course. The grief was that 55 years after Selma, and even after electing twice an African American as our president, we still struggle with our American original sin of racism. And the hatred and the ugliness that Martin Luther King experienced and that took his life remains with us, and is even finding validation, again, at our highest level of government. The hope, and yes, even the joy, however, I felt came from seeing and hearing the voices of a highly motivated, deeply committed, largely African American generation who were reaching back to a time and to an event from over half a century ago, before most of them were even born, to gain strength and guidance as they now bring their efforts and their energies to our overcoming our original sin. This is our Selma. Who are we? We, under these stars. The question is as crucial right now in our national life and as part of our American story as it ever has been. Ascent of the mountain, flight of the dove. Direct experience of transcending mystery and wonder. Between the picturesque metaphor Novak offers and the words from the first source of our Unitarian Universalist living tradition, we find insight and deeper meaning into the term religion itself. In that sermon I gave last summer, I noted that the root meaning of the word religion comes from two Latin syllables, re and ligare, L-I-G-A-R-E. Re means again, as in repeat or retell or renew. Ligare means to bind together. Among other terms, it gives us our word ligament, those things that hold our bones together. Combine re and ligare, they give us our word religion. To bind together again. To seek out those things that ultimately bring our lives together and give them their wholeness, however broken at times they may be. Religion, re ligare. And so I urge you then to stay open, to stay available for those moments of transcending mystery and wonder as you ascend your mountains and catch your glimpses of the flight of the dove. Amen. And blessed be.